Assignment 4, Psychosocial Development. I am Joel Sutton. This is Human Growth and Development, Summer Semester, University of Oklahoma. Before I begin the presentation, I would like to first take a quick moment and express my appreciation for having an opportunity to present this presentation as an alternative to a written paper. I will also say that having now completed the research and development of this presentation, a written paper would have been much easier. That said, while I have a lot of experience making these kinds of videos, I do appreciate and welcome any cool or warm feedback with regard to overall presentation quality, expectation, etc., etc. And I will acknowledge also that I am quite nervous in recording this, so thank you. Okay. U.S. Executive Order 14168, signed by President Donald Trump on January 20th, 2025, hit me and a lot of other people around the world like a brick. The executive order, entitled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government, seeks to identify or classify the summation of human existence into a binary structure of male and female genders as defined on an individual case by the attending physician at the time of birth. They clarify these two genders, male and female, as an immutable fact, immutable being one that cannot be denied or quieted. This particular selection, as it just occurred within the last 18 months, but is also one I chose because it not only directly impacts me, but also as I aim to work with the LGBTQ plus community in my future practices, and I wanted to know more about it and how it impacts the counseling profession, both myself and others. However, this executive order does much more than its name leads. There's a rather lengthy list over here. I just want to point out a couple of them. Feel free to pause and review the rest if necessary. But the third one says move incarcerated trans persons from the facility they are presently in to the one associated to their gender at birth. This poses substantial risk, and recent court rulings in opposition of the executive order have allowed a handful of transgender people in prisons to remain in their current gender identified prison. However, it is a limited capacity at the moment, and the future will determine where it goes. I would point out that regardless of the person's physical appearance, due to the executive order, persons who may present female, for example, with developed breasts and potentially even bottom surgery whereby they've had their male genitalia removed and surgically altered to reflect that of female aesthetics, may still find themselves being housed in male-populated prisons. This executive order goes on to touch all sorts of levels of society. It is reported that as many as 15,000 active duty military personnel have been ordered to accept discharge papers as a result of their false identification of gender and adherence to a gender identification that the federal government no longer recognizes. Ultimately, this executive order creates a substantial amount of legal ambiguity. However, the purpose of this video is not to explore that ambiguity from a legal perspective, but to explore how it affects human growth and development. Just as an example, though, of some of the far-reaching further state legislative actions, we can see from some of these headlines I grabbed just some other ways that it is impacting the public, which will come into direct contact to what I'm going to discuss in a few minutes with regard to growth and development. But yes, the point is it is quite far-reaching. If we look at the placement of this executive order, though, on a multidimensional system like Bronfenbrenner's that I prefer to subscribe to overall, because I very much believe in the interconnectedness of all the different elements of things that have daily contact to an individual. This executive order would likely impact us at the macro system level. It is a top-down federal order that seems to be tangentially or directly touching and influencing almost every aspect of government, from military to national parks to public education. So how have helping professions responded specifically before we move on? The American Psychological Association has said that, quote, psychologists understand that gender is a non-binary construct that allows a range of gender identities and that a person's gender identity may not align with the sex at birth. So obviously we can see here immediately the APA does not agree with the executive order. Likewise, the American Counseling Association says the ACA members are committed to non-discrimination and prevention of harassment in all forms, including protections of transgender, gender non-conforming, gender expanse, and LGBT plus individuals. This actually comes from the ACA Code of Ethics. The term transgender itself, notably, is not a disorder or a diagnosis. So how does this connect to Erikson? Well, identity versus role confusion, stage 5, is where I see the biggest connection here. While Erikson says or felt that this generally occurs at age 12 to 20, and I would largely agree with that in most cases, people exploring gender identity may encounter this at any point in their life. In this crisis moment in Erikson's stage, the idea is that people must move towards adulthood by making choices about their values, their life goals, the how they want to proceed forward based on who and what they are. Possible negative outcomes include, of course, the inability to establish a sense of self, as stated by our textbook. Erikson assumed that the child or the adult is an active, well-organized individual who needs only the right social context to move in a positive direction. And that is where this is really, really key in the intersection of Erikson's stage identity versus role confusion intersects with the executive order limiting gender identity to a binary construct, because social context requires an exploration of several topics, such as who am I, what are the values that matter to me, how do I understand my body, my gender, my culture, my relationship to self, others, how do I present myself to others, and in order to answer these, again, Erikson believed that people needed supportive, validative environments, and unfortunately, that executive order has led to a lot of non or invalidating environments. So supportive environments help people to move from an exploration of an identity awareness to an acceptance of an identity. In an ideal situation, the outcome would be that I understand who I am, that I have language to define myself, and that I can imagine a future where I exist and succeed. A hostile environment, invalidating environment, would be one that interferes with that process of self-actualization and awareness. And it could be viewed as the negative outcome could be viewed such as the quote right over here, that the government, school, family, culture says people like me do not exist. And so if all those external entities are telling me that what I feel, what I think, how I present is unhealthy, is wrong, is not real, then the stress becomes internalized, and maybe the person begins to believe that they themselves are unhealthy, wrong, or unacceptable. So the developmental task in stage 5 is not necessarily to choose a label and say, I am X, I am Y, but rather to develop a coherent, balanced, understandable perception of oneself that is livable and brings health and happiness and joy to that person's life. For transgender and gender diverse people questioning public policies that deny the legitimacy of their identity, that may very much negatively affect them. It may give them confusion, cause them to feel shame, to hide and conceal themselves, their true self, from those around them. It may provide that social invalidation as others accept the government's position and do not recognize or allow that person to thrive in their own way. So ultimately, these kinds of situations can lead to anxiety, depression, and often suicidal ideation. So to back that up, I'll show some results here from, this is the Trevor Project, which is a global recognized organization that works to support transgender and LGBTQ Q plus community. And they did a study in 2024 that was absolutely massive. And among their results, they found that 45% of transgender non-binary youth in America are currently reporting that their families are actively looking at or considering moving to another state, primarily due to politics, such as the plethora of screenshots I grabbed earlier of headlines. So immediately we can see how families are considering relocating as a result of these policies. And of course, relocation is hard on any person. In the same study, they found 28% of transgender non-binary young people reported that they have been physically threatened or harmed in the past year due to their gender identity. When others invalidate their gender identity and threaten, bully, attack, or diminish it, of course, that is difficult not to allow to see in a world in which that does not pose anxiety, stress, fear on the person. 66% of the community, the queer communities, young people reported experiencing recent symptoms of anxiety, definitely linked to what I just said. However, in the smaller text, you can see right here, it says that 7 out of 10 transgender people and non-binary young people experienced that symptom of anxiety recently. That's a full 70% and substantially greater than that of the general public. 1/3 will experience anxiety disorder at some point in their life. Finally, and this is probably the scariest of all, while 40% of the queer youth community stated that they had considered suicide within the last year, that number was 46% within the trans community and the non-binary youth. This is, again, substantially greater than that of the general public, and a lot of the reported reasoning for it has to do with those public policies previously mentioned. The American Academy of Pediatrics and both the American Psychiatric Association have been rather outspoken in recognition that there is, as the AAP here puts it, quote, "there is no evidence that risk for mental illness is inherently attributable to one's identity of transgender or gender diversity." So if they are in fact not at a higher risk of it based on their gender identity, then the elevated anxiety and risk of suicide has to be stemming from somewhere. So what does the research say? According to the AAP, it comes from discrimination, stigma, and social rejection. In other words, the social invalidation that they are feeling. As the APA says, that being transgender or gender variant implies no impairment in judgment, stability, or reliability, or general social or vocational ability exists based on them being trans, again, or gender diverse. So once again, it's not about what they are, but it is because due to discrimination, due to a lack of civil rights protections in their gender identity. This slide presents a finding of studies that show how public policy that implemented what we are discussing, anti-trans legislations, resulted in dramatic increases in suicide ideations. So if invalidating behaviors result in emotional harm, then what happens when a person is received with a validating care, warmth, etc.? Well, according to another survey just 2 years ago that included more than 90,000 transgender persons, the largest single transgender study ever conducted. Post-transition, and meaning having transitioned and in the process of receiving gender-affirming care, whether it's hormone replacement treatments or something else, as the chart up top identifies, 79% identified as feeling a lot more satisfied with life overall, 15% a little more satisfied. Directly here, we can see it says respondents who had socially and or medically transitioned showed substantially higher levels of happiness, thriving, and life satisfaction. I originally discovered this by CBS News. So what are the counseling implications? Well, developmentally, let's preface actually by saying that While the aim of the counselor is not necessarily to engage in politics or political discourse with the client, though in a feminist therapist perspective, that might be a little bit different, even part of their process. The aim of the counselor in this situation is rather to remain mindful of the institutional policies that are impacting, both validating and invalidating, the experiences of the transgender, gender non-binary people, and to help provide them opportunities to explore and understand themselves and their identities. So from a counseling developmental perspective, how do we assist? Well, first, we need to affirm their identity exploration, not stigmatize it. We need to assess them for safety because the literature suggests that those people are at a substantially higher risk already for self-harm, depression, anxiety, and suicide. We need to help provide them with coping mechanisms for all of the formerly mentioned. Ideally, we should try to engage them in ways to help strengthen social and family support systems, provide psychoeducation so they can better understand the feelings they themselves are going through, so that they also understand that they are not alone and that it is not a unique challenge. And then we need to help them separate their internal identity from those external political invalidations. Research clearly shows that supportive mental health care greatly reduces the risk of depression, suicide, and other negative outcomes for transgender and non-binary youth. Psychotherapeutic treatment for transgender and non-binary youth should aim to help children and adolescents explore, as I said, explore their identity, not change their identity. And this comes from the American Psychological Association, published in May 2025 in response to the previously mentioned executive order from January 2025. So if we break this down into specific counseling orientations, first and foremost comes to mind is person-centered therapy. The three core components of Rogerian-style therapy of having, displaying and approaching with empathy towards the client, an unconditional positive regard or acceptance of the client, and a genuineness both of yourself and an encouragement of themselves, is critical in any therapeutic orientation when working with these kinds of clients. From a feminist perspective that I also very much subscribe to, we would also explore directly the societal imbalances of powers that are affecting them, how these laws and executive orders are impacting them, and help them to understand that the sense of harm and anxiety that they're feeling is not them being wrong. It is often something that they are trying to be molded or forced into that may not authentically be themselves. Gender affirming care is about, as the name implies, affirming who and what that person is and helping them explore it and come to accept, live, and enjoy themselves rather than feeling that shame or incongruence that that executive order is likely trying to force upon the person. It's addressing their gender dysphoria or their gender incongruence, their anxiety, their depression, and the way they feel from the discrimination, not about trying again to change who and what they are. Now, there is a subset of CBT called LGBTQ affirmative CBT that I found some research on that was really, really interesting. And full disclosure, I do not know much about it, but it basically utilizes existing CBT methodologies, adapts it to minority stress, targeting specifically the stresses, the minority stresses that are being felt by the members of the LGBT and the transgender community. And instead of trying to say, those are irrational thoughts, it tries to reframe it in a context or in a way that allows the client to cope or develop coping strategies that strengthen their self-advocacy, helps them to resist internalizing shame, and locate sources of community support. And that last part, especially in developing fostering a sense of empowerment, is very much in line with feminist goals. Additionally, acceptance and commitment therapy is really has a lot of evidence-based backing to support that, as well as group and peer support, because primarily, especially in the group and peer support, one of the overarching goals is to help people see firsthand that they are not alone in this struggle, that there are other people who are experiencing similar discriminations or similar feelings of discrimination, similar challenges of identifying identity, similar situations, and that sense of developing community. Finally, outreach, advocacy and outreach. Oh my gosh, I have an extensive list here. There are so many ways that a counselor can engage in advocacy and outreach. Everything from trying to help a school develop a more inclusive place by establishing gender-neutral bathrooms, teaching staff and teachers the value of using the students' identified names or pronouns, to helping not out students who are not ready to come out socially or publicly, to engaging in crisis intervention, to helping develop safety plans for clients, to developing referral networks for clients. There is a very, very, very long list of ways to do that. Many people may want some additional resources for that. There are lots of opportunities out there. Professional nonprofit advocacy groups such as PFLAG, Trevor Project, 988 Suicide Line, the Trevor Lifeline are all 24/7 available resources. Professional organizations becoming involved in those, such as the ACA, the APA, the APA, that's confusing, and then SAGE, which is the Society for Sexual, Asexual, and intersect, not interest, and gender expressive identities, is also it's a member of the ACA umbrella organization and does a lot of public outreach and training to help counselors become better educated for working with members of this community. Of course, if a person is interested in engaging in legal action to affect public policy change, there are, of course, groups such as the ACLU, Lambda Legal, Transgender Law, the NAACP, and GLAAD that are always looking for support. Finally, references. These are the references utilized in my research for developing this presentation. I apologize for the time. I will probably write a paper next time. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this. I look forward to next time.